Hey folks, Bowman here. Just thought I'd do a quick video after getting a little cooped up with some super cold sub-zero weather. Been a little bit cooped up over the holidays here as a result. Not able to go out and run saws, or at least I don't like to in sub-zero weather. And I hope you all had a good Christmas. And thought I'd talk a little bit about one of my beloved chainsaws, my 281 XP. Parts built in 86, assembled in 87 when I bought it, and was able to put this saw back in service this last year. You've probably seen it on a few of my videos. Beautiful saw. At the time, one of the higher end Husqvarnas, good production and firewood making saw. Developed quite a following. I certainly have a soft spot for it. Not at all going to imply that it's the best saw Husqvarna's ever made. You know, that's a different debate. So I'm not going to claim that this is better than the 365 or 372 series or 395s, but this old Generation 200 series saw, those are some good platforms, just beautiful, competent saws, and still today very worthy of use if you can still find the parts for them. So I built this saw about a year ago, or rebuilt it I should say, after it had been sitting in a old dusty shed for over 20 years, and able to bring her back to life. I invested in some replacement parts for it, and got to the point of looking for a replacement crankcase just in case I needed to. And well, this past month I was able to find this online, used crankcase, actually in fairly decent shape. So thought we'd chat a little bit about the 281, 288 XP saws that Husqvarna made beginning in the mid 80s through early 2000s. You can still find these overseas in places like Malaysia and Brazil, but you won't be able to find them brand new in the States or North America anymore. And these crankcases, if you buy them overseas, are awfully expensive. I was able to find this particular one on eBay for less than $100, and looked pretty good. So we're going to take a closer look at this. Over time, I'm going to build this saw and probably do several parts of that rebuild process and post them for you to look at, for any of those folks interested in these old 281s, 288s. So let's chat a little bit about them. If you look right here on the plate, there is a online posting of how to decipher the serial numbers and when your saw was built for Husqvarna. And this particular one I purchased in 1987, so I know that's when it was built. The 7 at the front end of that serial number indicates that it's a 1987 saw. The next 2 digits are the week. In this case, that would have been around the 3rd or 4th week of February that this saw was built, and then the remainder of it, I believe, is just the series, the number of saws that came off the production line during that month, although don't take my word for that. But there's another way you can tell what decade these saws were built in. So if we go over to this crankcase carcass that I invested in, you can see it was also produced in 1987 and mid-June. Now I know this was the 80s and not the 90s, because as with my saw, I don't know if you can really see it here. Let's see if we can get some light on the subject. But you see this little cotter pin, and yes, indeed, that is a cotter pin. That was the old style of oil tank vent for these saws. And by old style, I mean the first 2 production years from 1986 and 1987. After that, they went to a newer style oil tank vent that was a sintered bronze. And I could probably convert that if I want to drill it out to the right diameter. But at any rate, I know that that was a 1987 saw. That's how you tell the difference. Otherwise, the crankcase amongst the different years of production are exactly the same. There's essentially no difference. And the 2 saws are almost exactly the same except for the top end, the cylinder assembly and the associated cylinder cover, because the 288 has a decomp on it. But otherwise, you're talking about exactly the same chassis. And so in this particular case, I guess I've decided that instead of simply holding on to the crankcase as a spare part, because I'm probably never going to wreck my crankcase on my original 281, I'm going to build this into a 288, and that's something you can do with a lot of the Husqvarna saws. For example, you can take a 365 and upsize that to a 372 by changing the top end and then some of the intake and air filter components. So you can do exactly the same thing from the 281 up to a 288. So that's what we're going to do, and that's what I'm going to show you over time here. But today's video, I'm going to get into a little bit on assessing this crankcase. There's a few issues to take note of. The crankcase itself is fine, but some of the bits on it are different. You can see it was missing the gas cap. I put on one of the new flippy caps, which, by the way, are just absolutely the bee's knees. I love those things. So I'm probably going to replace the oil cap with that as well once the, if I think the O-ring is bad on it. And the other issue is right down here. You might be able to tell that whoever broke this saw down had tried to get the flywheel off and bust one of the fins. So they didn't go about that the right way. This saw definitely blew up. I'll probably show some of that. But I don't know why this flywheel got put back on, or maybe it never came off. In which case that worries me a little bit as to whether we will get it off. We can't salvage this crankcase if we can't get that flywheel off. And there's essentially no other bits associated with it, such as the various rubber components, and none of the case bolts or other mounting screws for the parts of the saw that are mounted to the crankcase are present, so I'll have to replace all of those. But at any rate, let's get into it here, and we'll start assessing this saw, try and get the flywheel off, and progress towards splitting the crankcase and taking out the crankshaft, assessing that, and removing the old crank bearings in preparation for a rebuild. So with that, let me get you set up on the other tripod, and we'll get after it. All right, so you can see that I've got some newspaper in the top end here. That's just to manage some of the odor coming from the saw. I don't know if you can see this, but look at all of that. There is a ton of junk in there. There was clearly a leak. Maybe they weren't using appropriate oil and fuel. It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that somebody did something rather dumb, like using conventional oil, motor oil, in the fuel. I mean, I've almost never seen a crankcase that looks like that. So there's something going on there. Let's see if we can. Yeah, so this does not move real easy. I should be able to freehand that fairly easily, and I can't. So the crank bearings or the crankshaft are shot on this thing. But at least I can move it. I'll maybe take a scope to this real quick, and maybe if I can record some video of that to kind of give you a close-up of what the inside of the crankcase looks like. So I guess before I waste any more time taking this thing apart, I want to take a look at the crankcase a little closer from the inside to just make sure that we're not dealing with some issues on the actual housing of the crankcase. See, I still have an oiler there. I might be able to salvage that and the bar bolts, and don't look like they're cross-threaded, so I'll be able to use a few bits from this saw. Before I look at the inside of this crankcase, I'm gonna take this tank and some of the other bits off of it here, and then we'll continue. So I'll do that off camera and then be back right with you. Oh, what the heck. We'll just do the whole thing here. Normally I'd be doing this out in a real shop, but I don't have a heated shop. So, much to my wife's consternation, I'm doing this in our finished basement. Alright, this should just pop out right now. Yep, I gotta take a couple more bolts off here, and I'll probably take that front AV mount off. It'll just make it easier. So we already, I can see right now, one of our first issues is this bolt here. It's got a nut on the other side, and it's much longer than it needs to be, so that is not the bolt that would normally be mounted there. So this was clearly just thrown back together after it was initially taken apart, just so that the handle assembly which came with it could easily be shipped and moved in one part. Let me get another tool. I need to get a needle nose plier to grab the nut behind there so I can keep. Actually, it wasn't tightened, so it looks like I might be able to just reverse that out and use my finger on the nut. Yep. Oh, it looks like I can reuse this bracket and the front AV mount, so I won't have to invest in one of those. All right, so this bolt was one of the things holding the front of this handle assembly in. The same thing is happening on the chain catcher, and I forgot about that. It's a typical thing you got to do, is take these off first. So I am going to need to get a pair of pliers. That one's cranked on there pretty good. I'll be with you in a minute. All right, we're back. You didn't need to see me struggling to get this started, but nice little narrow nose vice grips. We'll get into that spot, secure the nut so you can get off that. Oh, I think it's a, what do we got here? Yeah, pretty standard 4mm Allen wrench for the head on that bolt. All right. Always a challenge to keep organized when you're taking all these bits apart. So I can see one of the case bolts for the top dog is missing. I've got a spare for that. I believe all of the old hex heads on these old Husky saws you'll find here. Also on some of the mounts up by the muffler, those should all be 10mm bolts. I'm not going to bother taking that apart right now. So now I should just be able to slide this handle assembly out and see what we're dealing with. That, okay, these old AV mounts, I'm going to replace those with the later generation hard spring AV mounts that they made for these saws. I don't really see anything jumping out at me for, you want to check all these just to make sure they look fairly sound. They haven't been reamed out, cross-threaded, so it looks like it's already taken out the fuel vent there. That could be an issue for reusing this assembly, but otherwise I think, other than all the bits that are missing here, we might well be able to reuse this old handle and tank. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, yeah, boy, they beat the hell out of this flywheel. I don't know if they even ever got this sucker off. That's an issue. Couple things you can do if you want to keep all of the pawls assembled, which there's no point to do that on this saw, obviously, but you could use string or a cable tie to put these back. You just need to be careful that when you're taking this nut off of the flywheel, and this will be conventionally threaded as opposed to reverse threads, like on the clutch side. But you could use a cable tie or something to hold these back, but you'd otherwise want to take these off. Hold them back from the nut. You can wreck these pawls and the bits on them if you're not real careful, because they're going to want to collapse on you. And I can see that the springs are okay. I might be able to reuse them, but let's at least get these pawls off. And so you can already tell here, I'm going to be fighting some stuff. So because this person that I bought this from, did not take the flywheel off before removing the top end, it's going to be much more challenging to get any of this stuff off because the crank's going to want to move on you. So one way we might be able to deal with that is to, again, you wouldn't want to do this if you're going to try and salvage, and I can see there's nicks all over this thing, so this person just didn't care about, either didn't know or didn't care about this flywheel. So if you're going to do something like this, as you're loosening it, it's going to come up against your case. Just be careful you're not cranking too much, because these are magnesium. You can damage them and crack them. But this is just going to serve as a bit of a stop so I can actually crack these open. They're on there pretty good. The other thing I commonly see with saws is that 90% of people out there, and there's, you know, to each their own, but it's not hard to find the torque specifications and find the old workshop service manuals for these saws. That way you don't risk over tightening, which is always a bad thing. I can see they put red Loctite on this. It's debatable whether you really need to do that. And blue Loctite probably would have been okay. So that's probably why these were a little bit harder. I don't know if they were necessarily torqued over to spec by whoever originally rebuilt this saw. And these parts all need to be cleaned up, but they're not rusting. I should be able to generally reuse those. All right, so given that this sucker was never off, the next challenging bit is going to be whether or not I can get this flywheel nut off using somewhat of a similar method here. Again, my goal here is just to clamp down on one of these fins. We'll see how this works. This just isn't how you want to do this, but we don't care about that, so this might make it a little bit quicker, I guess you would say, on getting this off. Usually these flywheel nuts are going to be, what is it, 13? Nope. This might be Yeah, that's a 14. All right, we'll see if this works. If not, then we'll use the standard method as outlined in the workshop manual to get this flywheel off. There we go, it's coming. So it wasn't seized. Not hard to get off. I don't know why this person didn't do it the right way. He could have actually made money off of that flywheel there and sold that separately. Yeah, we can reuse the nut, probably even reuse this washer. Just note when you're putting this back on that this is actually a spring-loaded washer. The concave portion of it is going to be facing you as you mount it, and then it'll get compressed down. That's how that locks. All right, now getting the flywheel off from here is, there's two ways to go about this. You can use what's called a flyway knocker. Threads on here, so you don't wreck the threads. I don't know if we're going to want to reuse this anyway here. Hear all that? You shouldn't hear that kind of. I'm thinking it's just the crank bearings that are bad. But by popping this down on the threads and then knocking it with a brass or hard plastic mallet may be all you need to loosen this off. The other thing is you can use actual pullers, which I do have. It's an OEM part for removing the flywheel. It'll screw into these two spots that the pawls are attached to, and then there'll be a bolt that will, with a point, it'll push down on the drive shaft. And you can both knock it as well as with the back pressure have it pop off here. So I am going to find that tool and come back, and we're going to try the knocker first just because it's a little quicker. And if that doesn't seem to work real well, because if this has been on there quite a while and seized a little bit, then we'll actually get that puller on it and see how she goes.